Why should test score differences among Asians or among blacks matter for who you admit to the university? You want to be inclusive? As Antonin Scalia once said, don't be so elite. You remember when he said that, Tracy? Yeah, I know. But he's got a point. He's got a point. There's a number of different margins that you can operate on. You can create de facto a very substantial difference in the test score cognitive measures between your black student population and your Asian student population, your white student population if you want to, or not. That's not the only path to diversity. The institution can give on a number of different margins, and one of them is on how elite you are. And if you give on how elite you are, that's all lives, not just black lives. What else have I got here? Moynihan wasn't wrong about everything. And you can't but read The Decline, Significance, and Truly Disadvantaged without realizing that the esteemed Professor Wilson agrees with me about that, although he might not be willing to say so in public.
He said it in public.
Oh, okay. I missed that one. Okay, but right on. I mean, look. Calling a spade does not add up to a social policy, okay?
Calling a what?
Calling a spade a spade. This is, Moynihan's claim to fame is, I told y'all. Okay, that's not a social policy, okay? But 7 in 10 African-American children born to a woman and raised by a woman without a partner? Okay, here's what I'm gonna say, and please don't take offense. Only a sociologist could believe that that doesn't matter. Common sense tells me that 48 hours a day of adult parenting time is twice as many as 24 hours a day of adult parenting time. Common sense tells me that raising boys and raising girls is not the same thing exactly, and it doesn't hurt to have a boy and a girl in the driver's seat when you're trying to raise the boys and when you're trying to raise the girls, and so on and so on. What is happening to our people, I want to say? Is it enough to repair to a structural historical argument in the face of such pathology? Hard word, a very hard word. I'm talking about kids. I'm talking about how they're raised. Okay, I'm speaking to a room that's sympathetic, of course, to the project of African-American empowerment. But can we stay in touch with reality? I think if we follow William Julius Wilson, we have a much better chance of doing so. Thank you.
Our next speaker is
Thanks,
Pattillo.
Yeah, my best man. Can you get your assistant to bring me a paper towel?
Sure.
Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's really a real honor. And I just want to start by saying, I don't know how you found the time to be such an amazing mentor. So my first memory of Bill was he invited me to lunch when I was just going to graduate school, when I was being recruited to Chicago. We went to Chinatown, and just me and him. And now that I'm a full professor, I'm like, who has time to be taking graduate student recruits to lunch one-on-one? So it was such, and we've heard this word generosity and humility, and it was such an illustration of that generosity and humility to make someone feel so special and to give the time to take me to lunch. Not even to Hyde Park, that would have been quicker. He could have just we could have gone to Hyde Park, but no, we went to Chinatown. So thank you so much. It has meant so much, and of course, that has then created the burden now, yes, that for amongst all of us, that we do have to give that one-on-one time. Well, I'm very glad I made the decision. Right. This is us. We saw your news trucks and cameras here recently, and we read the articles. 6 shot in South Shore Laundromat, and another mass shooting in Terrortown. We saw the reporters with fancy suits in front of our laundromat. You spent less than 24 hours here. You don't really know us. This is the beginning of the 2014 poem, You Don't Really Know Us, written collectively by the 5th grade class at an elementary school in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago. which is not far from the neighborhoods where I've lived and studied since I moved to Chicago to work with Bill Wilson. The poem highlights the outsider's view of urban Black neighborhoods as dangerous and desperate. This outsider gaze is something that I've pondered throughout my career and perhaps even before I was formally trained as a sociologist. Having been bused from a working class Black neighborhood in Milwaukee to a predominantly white suburb, this issue of how Black urban neighborhoods are perceived was already salient for me when I was first introduced to Wilson's work as an undergrad. I entered college the same year that The Truly Disadvantaged was published, 1987. I read it in probably every sociology class I took, and it was transformative. It taught me so much about how the neighborhoods I had traversed growing up in Milwaukee came to be as they were, and how the people I knew were affected by labor market shifts and population movements and the policies that facilitated them. Reading The Truly Disadvantaged taught me how structural forces, of course I didn't even know the word structure before having read it, so how structural forces work, and made it clear that the full story is never easily apparent. So when I was thinking about graduate school, there was only one choice. But at the same time, the world depicted in The Truly Disadvantaged was unfamiliar to me. It was just one slice of Black life. And indeed, the title said as much. This was a book about the truly disadvantaged. But in the classrooms where I was reading it, filled with many of the outsiders gazing in, it seemed to stand in for the whole of Black life. This issue of how we social scientists analyze and depict Black communities is what I want to talk about today. And I'll do so by bringing these pieces of poetry and prose written by Black residents of Black neighborhoods and Black communities who are also analyzing and depicting their own surroundings. Their words, I argue, often move us from an emphasis on pathology and oppression to one of celebration and resilience and agency. So the fifth graders that wrote that poem in South Shore already are familiar with the negative images about Black neighborhoods that permeate every possible medium. This pathology paradigm has a long history in the social sciences, from E. Franklin Frazier to Daniel Patrick Moynihan to Kenneth Clark to Charles Murray. Many of us have no doubt written a sentence or two that fall into line with that ideology, where we emphasize the bad behavior without attempting a deeper understanding of the root causes. I'm not suggesting that we stop doing this work, that we stop looking at drug addiction, chronic unemployment, school dropout, family instability, or crime and violence, but rather that we follow the lead of the truly disadvantaged and put them in structural context. But more importantly, I'm also challenging us to go a step further and present the other side of Black life, the good behaviors, the positive adjustments, and the contributions. I'm encouraged to see the next generation of scholars doing exactly that, whether it's foregrounding stories of difficult but no less upward mobility, like the work of Anthony Jack, which has been mentioned today, or Black collective resistance and protest to school closings in Chicago in the work of Eve Ewing, who also studied under Bill, or my own former students, Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter, who in their book, Chocolate Cities, have pushed the methods and frameworks of sociology to center how Black folks see their world and see the world more broadly. I think we're moving in the right direction of greater balance and thus greater empirical accuracy in our depictions of Black communities. In doing so, we'll be heeding the call of our fifth grade poets who are directing us directing their words to the media, but who could have just as easily been admonishing us sociologists. Their poem continues, quote, "We want you to know us. We aren't afraid. We know that man on the corner. He works at the store and gives us free lemon heads. Those girls jumping rope are Precious, Anaya, and Nivea. The people in the suits are people not going to funerals, but to church. That little creepy dog is Cyanus, Lamar's dog. We are the kids who find crates so we can shoot hoops. When the sun shines here, it's not God saying he wants to burn us. He sees us all with bright futures. Those who know us look at the ones who want to go to college, not the ones who dropped out of school. If you listen, you'll hear the laughter and the chattering from the group of girls on the corner who are best friends and really care about each other. Do you see the smile on the cashier's face when the kids walk in? Why? Because this neighborhood is filled with love. This isn't Chirac, this is home. This is us. Woo! To the fifth grade. So why is it so important to counterbalance the pathology narrative? Well, what kind of public policies come from a pathology narrative? Legal scholar Patricia Williams writes, quote, "In the context of today's ghettos, inner cities, and those places doomed to be called third world, policies often envision poor and dying populations as separate, distant, severable. Severable. In other words, there's nothing good to be saved here, so let's just cut it off. Withhold resources, start fresh." That kind of mindset explains practices like some slum clearance and urban renewal of the past, and school closures, public housing demolition, and most aggressive gentrification of the present. Such approaches assume Black communities have ruined themselves and thus should not be consulted, trusted, nor included. Of course, sociologists roundly dispute this, but we often spend 80% of our manuscripts describing the ruin and 20% of our manuscripts explaining how it wasn't self-inflicted. That math, however, still leaves no room to describe what exists beyond the ruin. Zora Neale Hurston, Ruben knows I have to bring Zora Neale Hurston in here. Zora Neale Hurston takes up this theme in her essay, Art and Such, in 1938. She writes, quote, "Negroes love and hate and fight and play and strive and travel and have 1,001 interests in life just like other humans. When his baby cuts a new teeth, he brags as shamelessly as anyone else without once weeping over the prospect of some Klansman knocking it out if and when the child ever gets grown." Hurston offers some other things for us sociologists to study, namely those 1,001 interests in life. This session is entitled Race, Class, and Culture. It's unfortunate that when culture gets taken up in sociology, and especially in the study of Black urban places, poor or not, it's often about cultural maladaptations. Wilson wrote in More Than Just Race, quote, "One of the effects of living in racially segregated neighborhoods is exposure to group-specific cultural traits that emerged from patterns of racial exclusion and that may not be conducive to factors that facilitate social mobility," end quote. Yes, I agree. But what about the culture in Black spaces that does facilitate social mobility? Or the culture that doesn't have anything to do with social mobility at all, but is just life-sustaining nonetheless? In a paper I've written with Marcus Hunter, Andrew Robinson, and Kianga Taylor, we try to highlight a few of those 1,001 things that Black folks like to do. Neighborhood reunions, Little League baseball, nightclubs, Black Twitter. These are also parts of Black culture and culture in urban communities. We talk about this as Black placemaking. I'm also encouraged that there's a generation of new social scientists who are taking up this call of doing what historian Earl Lewis said, that Black folks have turned segregation into congregation. So what does this congregation look like? UVA psychology professor Noel Hurd finds that neighborhood racial composition indirectly affects depression and anxiety among Black children, but not in a way that we often hypothesize. She writes, quote, "Living in a neighborhood with a higher percentage of African American residents also yielded salubrious indirect effects on adolescent psychological health. As we predicted, African American adolescents residing in neighborhoods with a higher percentage of African American residents reported more total social support and perceived their neighborhoods as more supportive and cohesive. These findings are consistent with previous work indicating higher levels of communalism and greater emphasis on intergenerational relationships. This is one of the few studies, they write, to consider the potential of psychosocial benefits of residing in neighborhoods with a greater proportion of African American residents, and provides an alternative perspective to scientific thought regarding the detrimental effects of living in predominantly African American, low-income urban neighborhoods. Benefits of living in Black neighborhoods? Benefits, perhaps, of being Black? Last spring, I taught a class called The Social Meaning of Race. In that class, I dedicated a day to all the benefits of being Black. Now, it actually wasn't easy, not because there aren't benefits to being Black, but because Google doesn't even recognize the search. When I typed into Google, diseases less common in Black people, the first result I got was, quote, why 7 deadly diseases strike Black folks most. It didn't say folks. Blacks most is what it says. Black disadvantage leads. The same is true when we try to find the empirical work on Black advantage in other domains, but it exists, and here are just a few highlights. A greater proportion of Black parents than white parents think that going to college is important. Low-income Black boys show more interest in college and are less likely to drop out when they have Black teachers. Black women teachers are the least likely to use exclusionary discipline in the classroom, even against white boys. Black fathers are equally or more involved controlling for co-residents. Black poor people are way more optimistic than poor white people. Black folks have higher self-esteem, lower suicide rates, now have significantly lower drug overdose rates, lower 12-month prevalence of mental illness, are less likely to smoke while pregnant, have lower incidence of atrial fibrillation, cystic fibrosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and skin cancer. What is it about Black culture, Black families, Black neighborhoods, about Black institutions that yield these positive results? And conversely, what is lacking in white spaces that disadvantage them? So the sources of these findings are all reputable, and there are many more I could cite, but they weren't easy to find, both because we are drowned out by the research that we sociologists do on Black disadvantaged, and because of some algorithm of Google that I can't quite understand. Don't get me wrong, oppression is real, racism is real, the unequal treatment of Black people is real, and the unequal treatment of Black neighborhoods is real. I don't have to cite the studies to this crowd on that front, and I'm not arguing that we sociologists shouldn't do that work to uncover the hard facts of racism. Instead, I'm arguing for a bit of balance so that our work is not used to justify policies that sever us. So I want to end with one last poem that captures the balance that I'm envisioning as we build on the legacy of Bill's work. The poem, which is entitled Repetition and Repetition and, is by Nate Marshall from his book Wild Hundreds, or as we say in Chicago, the Wild Hunnets, which refer to the part of the south side of Chicago where he grew up, where the numbered streets rise into the hundreds. He wrote, quote, ours is a long love song, a push out into open air, a stare into the barrel, a pool of grief puddling under our single body, a national shame, amnesia, and shame again. We are a pattern, a percussive imperative, a breakbeat. We are live on the airwaves until they close, in the pubs until they close, in the schools until they close. We are close to the edge of the city limits. We are limited to the hood until we decide we are not. Baby, we are hundreds, wild until we are free. Wild like amnesia and shame, amnesia until we realize that it's crazy to keep forgetting. And we ain't crazy, baby, we are wild. We are one, we are love. In 1987, I devoured The Truly Disadvantaged as offering a truth that I had not before heard. Now there are other truths to be told, but that can only be told because of the path-breaking career that we are here celebrating today. So thank you, Bill, for planting these seeds and allowing these many seeds to be told.
Our last speaker is Alyo.
My, what to do now? What to do now? I do want to express my appreciation for being invited into this space. As we all know, Bill Wilson has got hundreds, if not thousands, of students. And to be given the privileged position to be one of them to address you today is a distinct honor. And I'm greatly appreciative of that. I want to share a quick story that will actually connect quite directly with my brief, and I promise, brief remarks before you this afternoon about Professor Wilson and how this dovetails into my own project around things cultural and the study of African-American poverty, particularly black men. My pleasure at meeting Bill Wilson began in 1989, the fall of 1989, when I started my graduate work at the University of Chicago. I was advised prior to my arrival by my mentor, the late Jerry Watts, to go talk to Bill. When you get to Chicago, go talk to Bill. And he said, I know you already know that, but I'm gonna tell you something more. Understand that Bill is a little different in style. You might think he's not interested in what you have to say. You might think he's burdened by time commitments, but he's going to listen to what you have to say, and he's gonna take you seriously. So I showed up in the fall of '89, and after registering for my classes and going through orientation and trying to figure out the first phase of graduate school, I went to his office to make an appointment. And I saw his secretary, and she said, he's not here. I said, I didn't expect that to be the case. I said, when can I have an appointment? She said, I'm not scheduling appointments until the winter of 1991. I said, well, I guess I'll be back. Turns out that Bill was on a 2-year leave at that point in time. And so I did return in 1991. And he graciously gave me some time. As I was accustomed to doing at that point in my career, I had an index card with my comments written out. And I sat in front of Bill Wilson, and he said quite simply, speak. And I spoke from my card. I said, well, I'm here because I think what I want to do in graduate study and what I want to do as a scholar is study African-American men and the conceptions of social reality. I think it's an under-empirically explored and under-theorized dimension of their lives. That's what I want to do. And I was done. And he waited. And I come to understand that he was waiting for me to say more. I had no more. But ultimately, he said to me, what aspects of social reality do you want to explore? And it was then I realized I could salvage what was beginning to be a very embarrassing moment. Oh, no, I'm sorry. What he actually said is, do you expect to study all aspects of the social reality? And again, I realized I could salvage a slightly embarrassing moment, and I said, of course not. Having no idea precisely what aspects I wanted to study. But what he said to me then, which connects with the kind of mentor that he became for me and so many others, is, I'm not gonna tell you what to study. I'm gonna encourage you to think about how to make a choice about what to study. And what he went on to say to me then is, of course, you're interested in a lot of things. There's a lot to be interested in around black men. But if you aspire to make a difference in the public, think about what the public desires to know. Think about what the public might be assuming about this population. And invest your analysis in addressing those larger conversations. It was an early lesson in 1991 about how to think about becoming a public intellectual. And I thought deeply about that throughout my career. I've gone on to take quite seriously 2 particular terms that he offered as a scholar. And here I still marvel over the fact that as a scholar, he had this remarkable ability to bring common sense to complexity around poverty issues. Oftentimes as scholars, we problematize, we unearth more complexity. I think for me, the great jewel of Bill Wilson is he introduced, amongst other achievements, a series of concepts that made common sense of complexity. And two that I took was social isolation and concentration effects. When I thought about what I wanted to do and why around black men, I thought, what does social isolation mean for these individuals? Not simply around how they think about or don't think about work and work opportunity, not simply the extent to which they're connected or disconnected from formal institutions, but how might that shape, I hope that's not the end of my time. Good enough.
So sorry.
How that might shape their imagination of different aspects of the social world they lived in. How might concentration not simply play a role in instrumental objectives around how to access people, tools, resources for getting ahead, but how might living in a concentrated context of poverty embed understandings, interpretations of reality that erase the capacity or possibility for thinking differently? In other words, what might people not know, not consider, not think about as a result of their being socially isolated and living in concentrated poverty? So his advancement of those two terms gave me intellectual life to begin to pursue the work that I have been pursuing for the past 20 some odd years. Another core contribution of his work, and this was touched upon by others, Cornell, some others throughout this gathering, is the power of the historical analysis in the declining significance of race, where there's a particular project in that historical analysis that I would argue was still underread, underconsidered, that was central for my work. And that is how he historicized how black folks made sense of hope and opportunity throughout the 20th century. And it became a lesson in thinking about the historical domain, even if one's work isn't historical in an explicit sense. So for me, thinking about black men and how they imagine aspects of social reality had to connect with why those imaginations surface today, why images of hope surface today, how they compare and contrast with the past. And a historical perspective on hope and opportunity for the black community is, I think, the undervalued thesis of the declining significance of race. Again, it surfaced for me because it made me come to terms with why black men, and most of my career has been spent on investigating why black men desire and hope for that which is precisely no longer in existence around work and work opportunity. How might the inability to find opportunity and prospects contemporarily be tied to an imagination of success in the past? That's where history comes alive contemporarily for black men, at least in my work. And it also helped me to understand why they don't talk about certain opportunities that might seem obvious or commonsensical to the rest of us. Right? So it's a history that comes alive in work, even if it's not historical work per se, and the ability to think in that way, a product of being associated with this guy. I have tried in the course of my work to advance some projects that directly connect to some of the conversation we've had so far. And again, Bill Wilson has been central in allowing me the space to do so. I've had the unique and often challenging life experience of trying to stand between what might be construed as cultural sociology proper and race and urban poverty studies. And oftentimes being told from audiences on one side, what does your work have to do with our conversation? What might be the relevance of talking about Sartre and Bourdieu and Althusser, all of whom I cited in my dissertation while studying black men? Well, Bill Wilson gave me the chance to exercise those opportunities, because what I wanted to do in approaching black men and trying to not so much depathologize some of the conditions, circumstances, agency that unfolds for black men, but depathologize the image of them as solely only committed to a set of activities, a set of involvements that we all know are problematic. And to use these theorists to try to unpack that. At the time in which a blossoming cultural sociology was emerging, people started reading Althusser and Bourdieu and other folks, leaders in the field like Michèle, Lamont, and others, convening opportunities to think not so much about culture as embodied, but how we can use cultural analytical tools to make sense of the human condition. That became my project in sociology. It meant not surrendering to an argument that black men are inherently pathological, that black men submit to a subcultural dynamic that oppresses them, but rather to think about how they are cultural actors like everyone else. And to use the tools and resources to understand meaning-making, perceptions, visions of the possible that we all have. And hence to help try to shift the conversation away from a sole preoccupation with the pernicious. Doesn't mean that that's not a value. I understand quite well, Mr. Loury. Shooting a gun driver down the street, I don't want to see that. Those persons need to be sanctioned and punished. I also understand there are 20 million black men in America. Many who are poor, many who are impoverished, many in jail, not because they waved a gun, but because they stolen some food or did nonviolent crime and have gotten locked up because of that. That's the image I want to see surface. Doesn't mean erasing the problems, it means envisioning a broader, more diverse understanding of who and what this population is. And the concepts and the vision of Bill Wilson gave me those tools. His patience for allowing me to bring in a bunch of critical theorists on my dissertation committee with him and Richard Tao and some others. A little bit unusual, even by Chicago standards. But he gave me the space to make that happen. And the other critical lesson that I learned and try to deliver in bringing together theorists and poverty scholars is that aside from the very important project of addressing poverty, aside from the very important project of trying to solve social ills, is the project of theorizing the human condition from the vantage point of black men. We might come to understand various social processes, social dynamics that apply to all of us from that empirical point of consideration. And that, I argue, is still a project for us going forward. I will suggest that there needs to be an alternative rereading of Bill Wilson's work in that tradition. Many of us have said the work still matters. We get that there are lots of poor folks of color, lots of poor black folks. But even in thinking about the very two concepts that have been so significant to my own work, social isolation and concentration effects, I suggest that for us to make better sense of the human condition as scholars and intellectuals, we reread that work and apply them to the 1%. They're as socially isolated as the urban poor. They're as concentrated amongst themselves as the urban poor. And much of what they misunderstand about the urban poor is a result of their social isolation and the effects of their being concentrated within amongst each other. So saying that means to say that, Bill, a remarkable accomplishment for you in affecting me is not simply giving me tools for analysis for black men in urban poverty, but in a unique way providing the opportunity to de-ghettoize the study of the racialized poor. If we take these concepts and ideas to other populations, we understand the generic contributions to social theory and social analysis that the work delivers to us. The final point I'll raise very quickly is the other great lesson from Bill Wilson is how to deal with the politics of controversy. Controversy. And by that, I don't mean to say that I have faced anything like the controversy he faced in writing The Decline and Significance of Race and doing his other work. Mine surfaces in churches where pastors say, well, don't black men just need a little more prison and a little less social programs? But that still means I stand in a space where, as a black man from an urban background who studies black men from urban backgrounds, there's a lot of controversy on the work that I do and the arguments that I make. And what Bill Wilson said, and I've heard other students, almost every student that I know has heard him say this and has repeated him saying this. Stick to your argument, defend your argument, be clear that your critics are saying what you said accurately. But also think about the bases for the criticism that they present. Whether they're accurate or not, what is driving their ability to respond to you in that manner? And that's the terrain upon which you engage. That is how you advance a public conversation. You can say you're wrong, you didn't read page 23 correctly, but you also need to say, or think about why the critique unfolded as it did and what it means. And to have effective public discourse means to acknowledge that, confront that, and think about interrogating that in your life. And that's the other great lesson. I am deeply appreciative of everything you've done for me. I'm deeply appreciative of what you've done to enable me to communicate, not just in the world of poverty and race research, but as someone that boldly and aggressively wants to speak about the human condition more broadly. And that, to me, is the power of your contribution. Thank you so much.
Bill wants to.
Bill.
Julius.
All right. First of all, Abby, are these proceedings being recorded?
Yes. And they're also being live streamed.
Live stream? Okay, all right. Gotta be careful what I'm saying now. I mean, I really enjoy these comments. I mean, they're just terrific. When I was listening to you, Mary, I was sort of reminded about some of the things that happened around the controversy involving the declining significance of race. And when I wrote the declining significance of race, I highlighted the improving conditions of the Black middle class and the factors that facilitated their social mobility. I also talked about the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in the Black community and the relative deterioration of the Black poor. Now, the book created a huge controversy, and I'll talk a little bit about that on Friday. And by the way, I would change the title of my talk on Friday and slightly amend it from Reflections on His Career and the Event to Reflections on His Personal Life, comma, career and event. I'm gonna have a lot to say about my personal life. You got to cut me a little bit last night, and so did you, Skip, but nonetheless, I think you want to hear it from me. But the book created a huge controversy that resulted, during the controversy, people ignoring what I had to say about the Black poor, and focusing mainly about what I was saying about the Black middle class, the improving conditions of the Black middle class. And I distinctly remember one gentleman saying, "What, if you listen to Wilson, it's going to reduce support for affirmative action." And I'm thinking, what about the most important part of the book? The deteriorating plight of the Black poor. And so, Mary, I was motivated to write a book, a sequel, to focus on the group that was ignored in the controversy, the truly disadvantaged. I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, so we have just a little time to take a few questions, but here I think we're all extremely inspired by demonstration of this mix of, conviction and deep engagement in scholarship that Bill's mentorship has produced, and also influencing the work of leading scholars. So we have several people, and we'll start with Karen Lacey, another very important student of Bill.
Hi, I have been watching a television show called David Makes Man. Most of you have probably seen it. I'm a little late to this show, just learned about it. And it's a television show that is about some of the issues that we've been talking about today. And it's also the popular culture version of Wilson's work. It shows very effectively what it means to grow up Black and poor and in concentrated poverty. that under those circumstances, you don't live in a world of unlimited possibilities, like people who have white privilege or people who have class-based resources do, right? In one of the episodes, a little boy who is 13 is coerced into carrying drugs for the neighborhood drug dealer. And it broke my heart to see that the circumstances of his life led to that conclusion. But then I started to think about the show the way I thought the average white person might, the way some of the whites in Jennifer Hochschild's study might. And I knew they would look at that little boy and think, he carried those drugs because blacks are inherently criminalistic. And the undergraduate students in my classes feel the same way. When we talk about mass incarceration, what they inevitably say is, look at all the black people in jail, that means they're criminals. So I think that what the television show does very effectively, and what sociologists do very effectively, those of you who have presented today, and more generally, is to show what are the conditions that lead up to that kind of conclusion. What are the conditions that led up to this little 13-year-old boy not having any other choice but to carry these drugs? And if we only start with the outcome, we're going to misunderstand not only his circumstances, but the way society works more generally to crush the aspirations of people who live in poverty.
Thank you. You want to identify yourself first.
My name is Phyllis, and I understand the justice system needs an overhaul. But my question is like, I live in Central Square, right? And the demographics of bad neighborhood has changed. Like if you look at the neighborhood in Central Square where they congregate, it's mostly whites, and they look like, not that I'm saying race should get into it, but the social reality of it is that it's mostly whites that look like they're dying off of drugs. And when you look at mass incarceration, the mass killings, it's like the whites are the ones pulling the guns. So I'm thinking, and she had mentioned it, like like when you keep seeing these, I'm sorry, when you keep,
question?
Well, I'm just trying to see how do you think the history books are going to change? It might be 50 or 100 years to get rid of the stigma of racism, but like they say, the first should be last and the last should be first. Do you ever think that it's going to change in reality?
Thank you. Let's take two more quick questions, and then we'll have the panel respond. And then
My
we'll
question is for Professor Loury.
Okay.
I didn't introduce myself before. I'm Colleen Larson, William Wilson's daughter. Are you familiar with the First Step Act?
Just a bit. I know it's been passed and it's trying to promote chance for formerly incarcerated people.
Right. And to reduce recidivism.
I don't know a whole lot about the detail.
Okay. Okay, then I'm not going to ask you that question. I'm going to ask you a second one then, because you don't know a lot about it then? Is that it?
I don't actually. There are people in this room who probably know a lot more than I do.
Then I'm going to ask you about black-on-black crime in Chicago. I'm from Chicago, and it's black-on-black crime is what's happening. So why hasn't Black Lives Matter? Why has Black Lives Matter ignored black-on-black crime if Black Lives Matter?
Okay, that can be a question for people other than me. But let me answer you. Okay, no, you asked, let me answer. So I'll be quick, okay?
Let
Oh,
me
you want to
just
take more
get-
questions? Okay, fine.
Let me just get the other question, and then we'll conclude. Go ahead.
My name is Yasuko Takezawa. I'm cultural anthropologist at Kyoto University, not Tokyo University, in Japan. And I've been teaching in the sociology department of race and ethnicity. And I've been leading international collaboration projects for over the years. First, I appreciated Professor Michèle Lamont's first the remark in the opening of this session when you pointed out the universality of racial legend and so forth from the comparative perspective. And my question is, but I need to explain why I'm asking. How do you evaluate the significance of phenotypical differences? Is it declining or is it inclining? And let me briefly explain why I ask. I've been looking at how racialization, what I term racialization, marginalization of Jews in Spain and so-called gypsies in Romania and Karamono in Japan are strikingly similar in Middle Ages. And these are groups all in intracontinental migration, not intercontinental. So this, in the United States, it's, although at some point, I do believe there's a very parallel patterns across the globe, but there are some differences between transatlantic experiences and Asian experiences. So I see these similarities, and also how strikingly similar between Middle Ages and today, when the discourse of privileges attributed to minorities, you're getting this service and so forth. So, and we all know from statistics and how much, if even among blacks, if you have more stereotypical features, eyes, and nose, lips, and skin color, you're more likely to get death sentences than those blacks who are not. So in terms of, how this intersectionality but it is, but how do you evaluate the significance of phenotypical differences? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm reminded by Abby that we're really running out of time now, and we have food waiting for us. So I'm going to discuss the last question directly with the person who asked, and I'm simply going to ask the four panelists to see if they want to respond to the questions that have been formulated, and then we'll move on. Glenn, do you want to address the question?
Well, yeah, let me address it very briefly. I don't think it's complicated. I think it's a question of framing and about how it is you engage in a certain kind of advocacy. What Black Lives Matter are going to say when asked that question is you're trying to change the subject. We want to talk about police violence against black people, and you want to talk about something else. I agree with you, they might say. I mean, I'm sure many would say, what you want to talk about is a problem, but it's not the problem that we are addressing ourselves to. That's what I think they would say. Now, just for my own account, there's a glaring dissonance, is there not, in invoking the value of black lives on the one hand and having nothing to say about the behavior that is costing black lives that happens to come from black people. But the fact that the people who are committing those crimes are black, did we want to emphasize that? Do we want to say black on black crime? Like that's something different from white on black crime or black on white crime? Remember, my position was beyond race, okay? That was my position. I think that's the wrong way to frame the crime and criminal justice issues more broadly. But given that you're in the business of trying to advocate against unaccountable police violence, it's not hard for me to understand why Black Lives Matter would frame the issue as they have done.
Did I just say one quick thing?
Who's going to stop you, man?
So I want my daughter Colleen to reread an article I wrote for the Brookings entitled "The Other Side of Black Lives Matter." Remember that article? Yeah, go reread it. The Other Side of Black Lives Matter, where I talk about the people who live in those communities. We tend to. I remember a mother coming up to me saying, one of the mothers in Chicago came up to me and said, "Professor Wilson, my son was shot last week, stray bullet by a gang member. And you know, Professor Wilson, no one cared that my son died. His name was not mentioned in any of the newspapers, on electronic radio or TV. No one cared, Mr. Wilson, that my son died. The other side of Black Lives Matter." So read that article. Okay.
Well, we'll conclude here unless panelists would like to add anything. Are you all good? Great. Well, please join me in thanking them. Do you want to announce
that
something?
list of why it's good to be Black.
Hi, we are going to start at 1:30, so lunch will be a few minutes short. So be back here at 1:30 and panel at 1:25. Is this okay? Oh, is this on? Yeah. Okay, better? Hello? Okay. So be back here at 1:30, please, and panel
Good afternoon. Welcome to the first afternoon session.
Good afternoon.
My name is Sandra Smith, and I am professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. They are, as all the other panels, will be held to 12 minutes each. I'm given 5 to 7, but I'm not policing myself on that, so someone else better. The reason is because I think it's actually unreasonable to ask us to stand up here and share a little bit about what William Julius Wilson has meant to us. I can't do that in 5 to 7 minutes, so someone will literally have to take me off the stage. So I was a sociologist before I realized what sociology was. And it was through the work of William Julius Wilson that I came to realize that. I was born and raised 125 miles south of here, Hartford, Connecticut. 1970. The first 10 years of my life I thought were pretty grand. I mean, I didn't have anything to compare it to, but I had 2 parents who worked. We seemed to live in a stable neighborhood. I rode my bicycle, walked to wherever I wanted to. It seemed to be a really good life. I didn't question it in any way. But around 1980, it felt like the world changed. All of a sudden, the adults in my neighborhood who had been fully employed were losing their jobs. And to the extent that they could find jobs, these were not jobs that were able to help them make ends meet, right? The girls in the neighborhood who were my age were starting to have babies. I have one classmate, her name was Sandy too, who now has a daughter who should be about 33 years old. I'm 48, she is 48. Many of the young men in my neighborhood started to get involved in crime, including robbing our house, which was kind of dramatic, as you can imagine. All of the issues that we have been talking about, in good part because, or talking about in the way that we do because of Wilson's work, these were things that were starting to happen in my neighborhood, and I'm watching it happen, right? It's actually quite a traumatic experience to go through it. Right? To know that you're living in a time and space when this kind of change is happening, you can't really make good sense of it. And it was worse because as the folks in my neighborhood and generally in the city of Hartford were losing their jobs, especially blacks and Latinos, the folks from the suburb who were predominantly white were coming in, they were coming into the jobs in the insurance industry, which was still booming. Hartford was the insurance capital of the country at that time. So there were lots of jobs in some industries. The people in my community didn't seem to have them. They were losing out, right? And so these were the questions that were on my mind, frankly, as like a 12-year-old, right? I was lucky in that I had a father who also liked to talk about these ideas. I think he's an intellectual in his own right. My parents are immigrants from Jamaica, so coming to this country in itself was a kind of transition, but then trying to make sense of these kinds of social structural changes, it was a point of conversation at the dinner table all the time, and probably planted the seeds of kind of a sociological imagination that I took with me when I went to Columbia University, thinking that I would be pre-law, maybe major in political science, ha. Then psychology, ha. I was kind of lost for the first year. And so I just started to read a whole heap. And I came across The Truly Disadvantaged, which had only been published about a year and a half before I came across it. And this was outside of any class context. I was trying to find myself through these readings. And it became my Bible. So I'm literally like 18 and a half, walking around with William Julius Wilson's, wherever I went, all marked up. It made sense of my world in a way that nothing else had before. It answered my questions, this comprehensive theory of change and what impact it had within communities helped me to understand who I am and how the neighborhood that I consider mine, my city, came to be, and how it wasn't just about what happened in Hartford. It was about what was happening all along the kind of Northeast and into the Midwest. So for me, this was deeply personal. I mean, it became intellectual, but my attachment to William Julius Wilson started when I was 18 and a half trying to figure out my world. And it was for that reason that I became a sociology major. I turned the book around, it said sociology, that's all I needed to know. So I started to take social classes and then eventually was introduced to Catherine Newman, who I think was the person who connected me to William Julius Wilson. And the rest is history. So your importance in my life is in some ways far deeper than giving me, a set of theoretical frameworks to think about as an intellectual. It's a deeply personal matter for me. You helped me to make sense of my world and my life, while also giving me things to think about with regards to these kind of broader structural issues. And so it's shaped what kinds of questions that I ask, how I seek to address them, how I try to engage with others. It's because of you, the inspiration that you were for me, that I am here today and that I've done so much of what I've done. Now, I have to say, I've been lucky. I'm an incredibly wealthy person. I have a couple of great mentors. And I think they're all in this room, including Kathy Newman and Sheldon Danziger and Michael Buravoy, who've helped to get me to where it is that I am, providing me some of the tools that I've needed. But Wilson has both provided me with the tools and the inspiration and given me a sense of who I am and why. So for that reason, and there's so much else, right? I could go on for another hour or so. I will spare you. For that reason, you will always be a giant to me in ways that really go beyond the scholarship. So thank you so much. So I am also lucky to be able to introduce the set of scholars who are here today and who will be speaking about their work and how it's been impacted by William Julius Wilson. The first is Raj Chetty, a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship and a 2013 John Bates Clark Medal, given by the American Economic Association to the best American economist under the age of 40. Raj is currently a professor of economics after leaving the West Coast, which we were very unhappy to hear about. Yeah, you notice you're the only one clapping, right? Then there's Paul Jargowski, who's a professor of public policy at Rutgers University Camden and director of the University Center on Urban Research and Education. Then we have Robert Sampson, who's the Henry Ford Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard and the faculty director, the founding director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. And last but not least is Patrick Sharkey, who is now professor at Princeton University of Sociology and Public Affairs. Welcome to you all, and we will go in order, 12 minutes each, maybe a little less because I've taken too much time, but that's okay.
So thanks so much. While we're getting that set up, it's really an honor and a privilege to be here at this event in honor of Bill Wilson, who's had a tremendous impact on my own thinking, my own career. Can't capture it as eloquently as Sandra just did, but share the sentiment very much. I'm, I think, one of the very few, or relatively few economists here, although I recently got a courtesy appointment in the Department of Sociology, which I view as a promotion, but I think some of my colleagues or they have more questions about that. So I'm going to talk about work in the session on how place matters and the influence of neighborhoods on life chances. And a lot of my research draws on modern sources of data, big data, to use the popular buzzword in Silicon Valley. And what I'm going to talk about is how I've seen time and again, as we work with these much larger data sets, we have the privilege of being in a position of having, enormous numbers of observations that prior social scientists like Bill and many others in this room didn't have. And I've been amazed by how the observations that people made with much smaller data sets, with more limited methodological tools, are very much borne out in our more recent work and hopefully refined. And so I'm going to give a few examples of that in the context of neighborhoods. And so I'll start with this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So the way we construct this map is using data from tax and census records, where we're able to look at 20 million kids who were born in the early 1980s, essentially all kids in America born in the early 1980s. We map those kids back to where they grew up, and then we ask what their chances of rising up in the income distribution are. And what we're showing in particular is a very simple measure of upward mobility. What is the average income at roughly age 35 for kids who grew up in families at the 25th percentile of the income distribution? That is a family earning about $27,000 a year. The map is colored so that red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility, if you look at the scale in the lower right, and blue colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. And so what you can see here is consistent with the simple idea that place matters. There's a tremendous amount of difference in your chances of rising up in the United States, depending upon where you're growing up. In some places, like in the Southeast, a city like Charlotte, for example, or places like Detroit, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, one generation later, on average, you're basically at the same level of household income as where you started out with your parents. In contrast, if you look at much of the Midwest or parts of the coast, you see much higher rates of upward mobility, in fact, higher than any country for which we currently have data. So this broad map, I think, has animated a lot of discussion in our own research team and among other scholars in the past few years as we've had access to data like this, trying to understand, what's driving this variation across places, what might we be able to do to increase upward mobility in the places where it's currently lacking and so forth. What's the role of neighborhoods, the role of access to jobs, a lot of the themes that Bill and others in this room have thought about over the years. So what I'm going to do is present a series of studies we've done, just briefly showing you a few different aspects of what might be going on here. And so one natural thing to think about, especially given the context we're in, is to wonder about the role of race. So you naturally see, for anybody familiar with the demography of America, that there's potentially a link with race here. Places with larger African-American populations, you see have lower levels of upward mobility on average. So how much of these differences are a manifestation of racial disparities in economic opportunity, and how much is this actually about the role of place? So one simple way in which we can look at that is to replicate the analysis I just showed you, but split the data, looking at black men on the left and white men on the right. And you'll see why I'm now breaking this by gender. There are really sharp differences by gender in what I'm about to show you. So we're showing here the individual own earnings of black men and white men, the same statistic that I just put up on the initial slide. So when you look at these maps initially, you might react by saying, oh, it looks like they've put these two maps on different color scales, like a red-yellow color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But in fact, you can see we have not. It's just that it's sort of like they're two different Americas. The distribution of rates of upward mobility is completely non-overlapping for black men relative to white men. The very best places in terms of upward mobility for black men, like Boston, for example, have worse outcomes or lower levels of income on average than the places with the lowest levels of upward mobility, like Charlotte, for white men. So race matters profoundly. There's a striking difference in rates of upward mobility by race, even conditional on the class in which you're starting out. Now, that said, there's also a lot of difference across places, even conditional on race, right? So if we look among white men, for example, we see much lower levels of upward mobility in Appalachia than we see in much of the rest of the country, right? So both race and place matter, I think consistent with many of the themes that Bill has talked about in his work over the years. So I showed you this map for men. Let's now repeat that analysis for women. You see a very different pattern there. So in particular, notice that the spectrum of colors that we're seeing on the two maps now looks pretty similar. And so more generally, what we see in the data is that if we look at black and white women, rates of mobility look relatively similar. So conditional on starting out in families at the same level of income, they're not identical, but black women's chances of rising up in the income distribution in terms of their individual earnings, not household income, because then you'd bring in basically the other map, men's earnings. In terms of individual income, you see relatively similar prospects. So there's a race by gender intersectionality that seems extremely important here in understanding what's going on. So in most of what I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to focus on upward mobility, and I think that's what a lot of us have focused on. How do we help low-income people rise up in the income distribution? But in the context of race, I think it's also quite important and useful to think about downward mobility, because I think that's a key driver of the persistence of racial disparities in the United States. And to show you that, I'm going to turn to this chart here, which shows you the dynamics of income mobility for Black and white men who start out in the highest income families in the United States. So what we're doing here is taking a set of men who start out in families in the top fifth of the income distribution, and we're asking in which quintile of the income distribution do you yourself end up in as an adult. The purple dots are for Black men, the green dots are for white men. You can see that for white men, you kind of float towards the top. If you're born to a high income family, you tend to be quite likely to stay at the top of the income distribution or in the upper middle class. In contrast, for Black men, you see a striking and really disheartening pattern. I think a really unfortunate fact about the United States, where there's a tremendous cascade downward, where even if you're born to a high-income family, you're growing up in a very affluent neighborhood, going to the same schools as an affluent white child, you see a much higher chance of falling towards the bottom of the income distribution or below the middle class. And so one way you might think about that visually is that for white Americans, achieving the American dream, sort of like climbing a ladder, whereas for Black Americans, it's like being on a treadmill, where even after you've climbed up in one generation, it looks like there's tremendous structural forces that tend to lead to people falling back down in the income distribution, men in particular, having to make the climb again. And when you have that kind of process, that treadmill sort of process, you're going to have a persistence of disparities in steady state in the long run. And so figuring out how you address these issues for upper middle class Black families seems equally central in understanding racial disparities in the long run. So in these charts that I've just been showing you, I've been showing you the data at a broad regional level or a national level. Much of Bill's work and other folks in this room has focused on specific neighborhoods within cities. And so what I want to turn to next is showing you some data at the neighborhood level. Here I'm going to go to Chicago, given its significance in Bill's work in particular. And so what we're doing here is now showing you the same kind of statistic that I started out with, but this is for Black children in the Chicago area, showing you the data by census tract. And so the first thing that you can see is, it's been noted, Bill's work and others, that the south side of Chicago has very poor outcomes for kids growing up in low-income families, and Black kids in particular. There's, however, even within Chicago and within the south side, quite a bit of variation, where you see some places where Black men have significantly higher chances of rising up than in other very nearby places. So this is a snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas, which is something that you can access publicly just by going to opportunityatlas.org, and you can look at any city and any neighborhood you like. And this is a very common pattern we see not just in Chicago, but many places across the country, where there are very sharp local differences in outcomes consistent with what's been documented in prior work. So naturally, a question of interest is what's driving this variation across places. And the famous theory put forth by Bill is that some of this might have to do with differences in employment prospects, the availability of jobs, and so forth. And so when we look at just a simple way of looking at that across metro areas, if we plot these measures of upward mobility against rates of job growth, or you could use rates of employment or wage growth, et cetera, you actually don't find that much of a relationship. We've done this at various levels, both at the metro area level and the local level. Is it the case that places that are more proximate to jobs have higher levels of upward mobility? You don't seem to find tremendously strong correlations there. So for example, you have cities like Charlotte and Atlanta that are booming in terms of employment prospects, yet have very low levels of upward mobility for low-income kids growing up there. However, I think there's a slightly different version of that hypothesis that does seem strongly borne out in the data, which is also consistent with work that my colleague Larry Katz has done, which is that if you grow up in a neighborhood where a lot of people are employed, they may not be working in that neighborhood itself, might be working somewhere else. But if you work in a place if you grow up in a place with high employment rates, you tend to have much higher prospects for upward mobility. So more generally, there are a variety of correlates of these differences in upward mobility, like having lower poverty rates, higher employment rates in your local neighborhood, more stable family structures, greater social capital, better school quality, all of which broadly kind of resonate with the idea that place matters greatly, environment matters greatly, but more through an exposure sort of mechanism. Being around people who have jobs changes maybe your perceptions, your aspirations, what you seek to do, and that ends up changing your life outcomes. So consistent, I think, with the broad themes, but with a slightly different wrinkle. If I can take 2 more minutes just to wrap up, I want to talk about one final angle on this. So we see that there are tremendous differences in opportunity across areas, and some people are unfortunately segregated into neighborhoods where they have much poorer chances of succeeding, and Black families in particular tend to live in such neighborhoods. So you might ask, why is that the case? What's the fundamental driver of segregation in the United States? Is it that there are deep-rooted preferences among families or among landlords to have folks live in different places? Maybe I want to stay in certain neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago because that's where my friends live, or that's close to where my job is, or for whatever other reason. Or is it that there are maybe some barriers that we could potentially address through policy that are preventing families from moving to higher opportunity areas? So in recent work with Larry Katz and other colleagues, we've implemented a randomized trial with housing voucher recipients in Seattle to test between those two hypotheses. And so here, in Seattle, you see in the Opportunity Atlas very similar variation in kids' outcomes across areas. And we identify the set of areas that are relatively high opportunity in the blue colors on this map. And we provide families a set of services, assistance in the search process, direct recruitment of landlords to participate in the housing voucher program, giving them an insurance fund and simplifying the inspection process and so forth, giving folks some short-term financial assistance to pay security deposits, $1,000 on average. The total cost of this program is about $2,600 per family. So it's about 2% of the total cost of a housing voucher. So it's a significant sum, but a very small marginal cost relative to the overall amount we're already spending on housing vouchers, which is about $20 billion a year in the US, helping about 2.2 million families. And so we randomly provide this set of services to a selected set of families. And here's the result of that. So if you compare the control group that just got the voucher and didn't get these services, 14% of them moved to areas that we'd classify as high opportunity. That moves to 54% in the treatment group with that simple intervention. You can see the impacts very easily just on a map. So the blue shaded areas here are the high opportunity parts of Seattle that we've identified with our data. The green pins are where the families in the treatment group moved. The red pins are where the families in the control group moved. And you can see that the small treatment significantly changes where people choose to live, and people in a dispersed way move to a broad variety of very different areas. So effectively, what you're doing is creating more integration here, and this happens both for white families and for Black families, suggesting that it's relatively small barriers that are preventing families from moving to these higher opportunity neighborhoods, where we estimate that kids who grew up in these blue-colored areas will go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes relative to the families who are in the red pins. So you can have really significant impacts by addressing these barriers. So let me end by talking about what I see as some of the ideas of William Julius Wilson that are pushing us forward in the era of big data. Place matters, as Bill has so eloquently emphasized over the years. And I think what we've learned is that it's primarily during childhood and perhaps via exposure to employed adults or exposure to a certain set of folks. Race matters greatly as well. Even for upper class families and even within affluent neighborhoods, we're seeing significant racial disparities. And I think understanding what's driving that is extremely important. Segregation continues to be an important and growing force, as others here on the panel will surely talk about. But encouragingly, and I hope this is ending on a hopeful message, it appears to be driven by small barriers and not deep-rooted preferences, which would be a much harder thing to tackle. And hopefully that gives us a path forward. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Just fabulous to be here. I was not, like many of you, I was not a student of Bill's at Chicago because I was here. But he's always supported my career and me in various ways, and as if I had been a student. It's been incredible. Thank you so much, Bill. Before there was the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, we had something at the Kennedy School, we had something called the Center for Health and Human Resources Policy, which was affectionately known as CHIRP. And that's when I was a graduate student in those days, and I was employed by CHIRP. And one of my jobs, of many, was to help organize lectures and seminars and things like that. And the most memorable of these was the Godkin lecture that Bill Wilson gave in 1988. And if you were here for that, you probably remember that every inch of the Kennedy School was packed. I could see legs hanging off the third floor rafters, and every level of the risers was filled to capacity. In fact, there was so much body heat generated that the fire alarm went off. Remember that? So there were some tense negotiations with the fire marshal, and eventually we got the okay to let the lecture move forward, but the fire alarm lights kept flashing during most of your speech. Well, that was actually fitting because Bill Wilson brought the fire that night. His target was those who simplistically criticized the behavior and choices of high-poverty ghetto residents without acknowledging or comprehending the structural factors that create and maintain those neighborhoods, and sharply limiting the resources and opportunities of those who live there. The lecture was a tour de force, and not just because of what Bill said, but also the moral urgency with which he said it. And I think he inspired me to work on these issues, and as he has inspired so many throughout his career. So I'm going to talk about why we have so many high poverty neighborhoods. I think that's the issue that I'm going to address. My colleagues on this panel have really definitively shown that highly disadvantaged neighborhoods have independent and long-lasting negative effects on children who grow up there. So my goal in these few minutes is to argue that we as a society are still not acknowledging or comprehending the structural factors that create the vast disparities that exist between neighborhoods in our metropolitan areas. And in particular, we refuse to acknowledge that these differences result in large measure from public policies at the local, state, and federal levels, and that we bear a moral responsibility to change those policies. Okay, so the number, how many people are in high poverty neighborhoods? Well, the number of residents of high poverty neighborhoods defined as census tracts with poverty over 40%, has fluctuated over the years. The number fell sharply to about 7 million during the 1990s. After 2000, though, there was a sharp increase, and then a much sharper increase after the Great Recession set in. By 2012, the population of high poverty neighborhoods had doubled to 14.5 million. It's come down a little bit since then. These maps show the expansion of high poverty neighborhoods in Detroit, with the census tracts with poverty rates over 40% indicated in red shades. One thing to notice is that some of the high poverty areas and marginal poverty areas that are shown in light blue are outside the boundaries of the central city that's indicated in red. So these high poverty zones have now sort of begun to go to the suburbs, and it's what we call the suburbanization of poverty. And that's also true in Cleveland, and I'm sorry I'm going to go through the maps fast because I do have the time limit, and also St. Louis. And if you look in St. Louis in the more recent data, in the upper left-hand corner, you see an area that's outside the central city. That's Ferguson. And that was an inner ring suburb until about 1990. It was mostly white and mostly low poverty, but it has obviously changed, and we know what has gone on there. So, but when we focus on the inner city alone, I think we miss the bigger picture. This kernel density plot shows the distribution of all the census tract poverty rates in the United States in the year 2000. And so the 7 million people that were living that year in high poverty neighborhoods are those in the tail of the distribution there beyond the 40% threshold, the cutoff point. So what happened? Well, by 2012, what you see is that whole distribution shifted. So the mean increased. It's the dotted line that shows the mean of the two distributions, and the standard deviation also increased. And so when you see that increase, it wasn't caused by the behavior of the people in that little tail. It wasn't caused by the culture of poverty in that little tail. It was caused by the metropolitan-wide structural changes in the economy and in housing markets. So we have to understand the connection of these neighborhoods to the broader system. We can also look at differences between metropolitan areas. Here's Cleveland and Atlanta, the distribution of their census tract poverty rates. They have the same mean poverty rate in the 2012 data. And yet, in Cleveland has a lot more people living in high poverty zones. So what's driving that? Well, because Cleveland is both more racially and more economically segregated than Atlanta. So I'm going to talk about racial and economic segregation and what drives those things and how those are responsible for creating high poverty neighborhoods. Despite some claims to the contrary, I regret to report that 50 years after passage of the Fair Housing Act, racial segregation is still with us. Some scholars, mainly economists, but some of them have trumpeted large declines in the segregation of blacks. However, I think their conclusion is too strong for a couple of reasons. First, they tend to measure segregation as blacks compared to non-blacks. But I think that the reason for studying segregation in the first place is that segregation isolates disadvantaged groups from the neighborhood amenities, resources, and opportunities available to the advantaged majority group. Since 1970, the proportion of metropolitan area residents who were neither black nor Hispanic, who were not non-Hispanic white or black, nearly tripled from 9.9% to 28.3% by 2015. These new residents, many of them Asian and Hispanic immigrants, often settled in neighborhoods with more affordable housing in proximity to African American communities. So the decrease in black, non-black segregation has been driven in large part by these changes. Did black residents secure more opportunities when immigrants moved into the relatively inexpensive neighborhoods near them? Probably not. It's more sociological meaningful, I think, to compute segregation levels of blacks from non-Hispanic whites. And those figures, when you compute it that way, show higher levels of segregation and smaller declines over time. Second, the decline in racial segregation is somewhat overstated because many metropolitan areas have very small black populations. So when you average across 300 metropolitan areas, you're averaging in a bunch of places with very small populations. When you look at places where blacks actually live, you still see very high levels of segregation for the most part. This is New York. This is a racial dot mapper. Every dot on this map represents one person. And green represents African Americans, blue is white, and you see a very high level of segregation. In fact, index of dissimilarity of 80, which means that 4 out of 5 blacks would have to move to achieve an even distribution. We can also look at Chicago. Again, very distinctive patterns of segregation. We have also, here's Detroit. In Detroit, it's so amazing. You can actually see the boundary of the city sketched out in the racial demographics. Okay? So this is unbelievable. And in fact, it shows something that most segregation today, I think 3/4 by my estimate, is not between neighborhoods so much as between political jurisdictions, central cities, old suburbs,